Why we normalize it'd be okay for women to have all these hormonal dysfunction?
Many of those symptoms are biomarkers of something much more serious.
The things when I think about my patients who have all these hormonal dysregulations, the sex hormone in particular and insulin, it's even the stress hormones, our diet is super high in sugar and starch. So carbohydrates are okay, but where are you getting them from? Are they whole grains? Are they beans? Are they vegetables? Are they fruit? Or is it flour and sugar? That matters. I think caffeine is another huge one that often adversely affects menstrual issues and hormonal problems. Alcohol is a huge one. I remember reading a study years ago that showed that if you were drinking alcohol and you were taking hormones, you with Premarin, for example, you would get toxic levels of hormones in your blood that cause cancer and other problems because of the alcohol. In fact, I think another study I read was women drank 1 glass of wine a day, which is not that much. According to some people, it increases the risk of breast cancer by 40%. That's staggering, and it has to do with how it affects estrogen and hormones. So you've got all that, and then you've got all the crap in food, all the hormones in dairy. That's a big one. Dairy, I think, is a huge one for people. And I think a lot of women with hormonal dysregulation get off dairy and they feel better. And there's 60 different hormones in milk, including growth hormones and estrogens and progesterones, and as not to mention antibiotics. So you've got all these things in our diets pretty typically that cause all these issues. And then, of course, there's all the hormone disruptors that you mentioned, the pesticides, the herbicides, all the plastics, phthalates, PCBs, dioxin, phenol, those are all flame retardants. They're in everything and everywhere, and it's hard to get rid of them. So those are all collectively causing problems. And then the stress, obviously, of how stress affects the hormone cascade, because stress is one of those hormones that connects everything together. And so you end up with this big kind of lifestyle environmental soup, not to mention the fact that only 8% get enough exercise, and sleep deprivation is massive. You add all these things together, and it's no wonder women have so many hormonal dysregulation issues.
Well, that, and I would say women are more vulnerable to them. So I think in some ways, especially for women who are still cycling, but also true for women in perimenopause and menopause, that our hormones get out of whack more easily than what we see with men. And we know that from looking at, if you just look at estrogen, which is the master regulator in the female body, the primary regulator, the kind of changes that women experience during the menstrual cycle and then in perimenopause are really steep, and they're quite sudden. They're much more abrupt than we see with men in testosterone, as an example. Yeah, and I'm so glad you raised alcohol, because, I read the same data, and I think it's important to realize that the glass of wine that you're having every single night, you're treating something with it. Wow. You're treating stress. You're trying to, kind of settle your nervous system. At least that was the case for me and for many of my patients. And we know that 3 servings a week is associated with an increased risk of breast cancer. Yeah. So as you described it, it creates more of what I think of as the Homer Simpson type of estrogen molecules, the ones that we don't want. We want the benevolent type of estrogen molecules, and you're not going to get that from alcohol.
No, it's true. And I think, so when you begin to look at those things, that's the first place people start with their lifestyle and diet. And I think you talk a lot about it in the book. And there's also not just what not to eat, but there's what to eat, right? So can you talk a little bit about what are the hormone balancing foods that we should be eating?
Well, they're the things that help you with your hormones. So that includes making sure that you're getting healthy fat. So my recommendation for 4 weeks is to increase your healthy fat so that it's about 60 to 70% of your calories. And
60 to 70.
60 to 70% of your calories per day. And this is for a few reasons. We know that fat is the backbone of hormones, the sex hormones, as we described. It also helps with decreasing gastric emptying, so it makes you feel fuller. It helps you with satiety. It's part of this process of nutritional ketosis where you make ketones, you feel more satisfied. But when you combine that with dialing in your carbohydrates, so what I really like for patients to do, for people who read this book to do, is to get your carbs so that it's less than 25 net carbs per day. So
that's low.
It's low, but it's if you're really eating carbs that are from vegetables and you've got that fiber that comes with the vegetables, especially the cruciferous vegetables, broccoli, cauliflower, radishes, and you've also got those methylating vegetables that help you to inactivate the a Homer Simpson type of estrogens. That's what really allows you to get into nutritional ketosis. And that's the protocol that's in the book. And then the remainder is protein, a moderate protein diet, about 20% of calories from protein.
Yeah. That's really quite different than the American diet, which is kind of the opposite, right? It's about 60 to 7% carbohydrates that are mostly starchy refined processed foods, and about 20% protein, or maybe 20% fat. So that's a big shift. And I think it creates a lot of changes for people. Not only will they lose weight, but they have mental clarity, more energy, they'll build muscle, they'll lose body fat, they'll build bone density, they'll reduce inflammation, everything gets better, right? And it's
yeah, I mean, the SAD diet gave me prediabetes. It doesn't work in terms of metabolic health. And so, the work I do is precision medicine. I think it's important for us to be thinking in terms of how to personalize diet. So nutritional ketosis is not for everyone, but for people to try it for 4 weeks to see how sated they feel when they're producing ketones, where they've got that mental acuity from this particular set of macronutrients, and then to see the metabolic flexibility that it creates so that you can flip back and forth based on the type of fuel available between burning glucose or carbs and burning fat, depending on what you're eating, what's available. That's what really works for people.
Can you talk about this idea of metabolic flexibility? Because I think it's fascinating, and I think it's something we really don't talk much about.
Yeah, metabolic flexibility, I think of like a hybrid car. So, one of my first hybrids was a Prius, and you could flip back and forth between burning gas or burning electricity.
Yeah.
And the body is very similar. You can either burn carbs, which I think of like gas, or you can use the electricity pathway, which is burning fat. Yes. And so, of course, the fat is more renewable. We've got more of it. And so what's important for folks to realize is that you want to toggle the switch back and forth depending on the type of fuel that you have. So, for me, this morning, as an example, I haven't had any food yet, and I'm burning fat. So I've got ketones. I feel satisfied. I don't feel hungry. I've got mental acuity. I'm able to focus. And that's hardwired into our DNA. Now, when I was eating more carbs, what I found was that I was hungry when I first woke up in the morning. I had more sugar cravings. My insulin was out of whack. It was too high. I was stuck in fat storage mode. It just didn't work very well in terms of, trying to live the deep life that I want to live.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so you get all out of balance. And what's interesting is that, the sort of, we talked about a little bit, but the cocktail of hormones that go awry in women's 40s and early 50s is really not well recognized. And that is this soup of hormones that get out of balance, including stress hormones, cortisol, the sex hormones like estrogen, progesterone, and all the other hormones related to sex hormones, thyroid, and insulin. And so those are very subtle things to play with in a body, and yet they respond really well to lifestyle, to the right supplements, to fixing your microbiome, to just tweaking everything, reducing toxins, detoxifying. I think one of the things you talked about earlier was really important, which is there are certain foods which we know help with hormonal regulation and balance. One of them is the brassica family of cruciferous vegetables. You mentioned that, but I don't want to sort of gloss over it. It's really important. I think women should probably have a cup or two a day of broccoli, collards, kale, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, that whole cocktail of vegetables, because of the compounds, the phytochemicals they contain that help regulate estrogen metabolism and sort of de-risk your estrogen from being a carcinogenic type of estrogen to a more healing, beneficial type of estrogen. And I think also the same thing is true around insulin and blood sugar. When you start to sort of get into the trouble with that, you've got to really do what you're saying is shift your diet towards more good fats and less starchy carbs. So we kind of know that if we kind of work on all these things, that actually women can really get rid of these symptoms.
김비우 우승, 이소영 우승, 정윤지 우승, 이준석 우승, 전인지 우승, 박민지 우승, 박지영 우승. 1등은 약속하지 않는다. 매번 증명할 뿐. 킹답게, 핑답게. king G430 시리즈.
You can. And, I think there's a few interesting areas related to this topic. One is that I was taught when I went through my training that the symptoms women start to experience after 40, the difficulty sleeping, the night sweats, the hot flashes, that those are these inconveniences that could be medicated with hormone therapy in the right candidates. But now what we're actually learning is that many of those symptoms are biomarkers of something much more serious, which is dysfunction of blood vessels, endothelial dysfunction. Yeah. It's a biomarker associated with bone loss. And so it becomes much more important, I believe, to get these hormones back into balance, starting first with diet and lifestyle. Another piece that's really essential is that having large blood sugar excursions, which was my story until I figured this out in the book, that can trigger hot flashes, night sweats, mood swings, many panic attacks, many of the things that women are starting to experience in their 40s. So the more we can dial in that metabolic health piece, along with balancing these sex hormones, the better off women are.
It's so huge. And I think we really just coming to understand that these are not normal things. They shouldn't be normalized, that women aren't just sort of relegated to being, quote, hysterical, which is I hate that word. It's like, it basically comes from hysteria, which is the uterus, right? Hysterectomy and hysteria are not unrelated.
I hate it too. I mean, I love.
Oh my God, it's terrible. Why we normalize it? It'd be okay for women to have all these hormonal dysfunction and not actually get to the root causes of it. So it's really not normal. Like 75% of women have some type of PMS, and 85% of women have some type of hormonal issues in their life. Why is this happening? Why has it been so normalized? And what are the root causes of all this hormonal dysfunction? And what is it?
Well, I would say the days of normalizing this need to be over, because women are suffering unnecessarily, as you just described. There's a lot of different hormone issues at play here. One is cortisol, related to toxic stress. It can be high, low, a combination of the two. Another hormone that gets out of whack is thyroid. So thyropause especially affects women about 7-fold more than it affects men. And that is a common cause of weight gain and hair loss and many of the things that women face. And then, as you described, estrogen and progesterone often get out of whack. That can be related to just the cycling years, the reproductive years. It can also be related to being postpartum. And then perimenopause is when a lot of this becomes a perfect storm of many of these hormones out of whack. Insulin's another important one, because so many women notice, especially after 35 or 40, that insulin's just not on their side the way that it once was. They become insulin resistant, which I think of as insulin.
It's not on their side, but it goes to their tummy.
That's right. It goes right to
their not to the side, but it's in the middle.
Exactly. And, I think there's a few issues at play. One is the way that our world is changing. It's related to stress. It's related to unrealistic expectations. It's related to overfunctioning and trauma, which we know affects women more than men. Men are still affected, but women more so. It's related to the food that we're eating, the way that our food has changed, which you talked to so brilliantly. And it's also related to the fact that physicians are not taught about this, right? Like, I wasn't taught at Harvard Medical School about this. I imagine you weren't either.
No.
We were taught to hand over a prescription for a birth control pill or maybe hormone replacement therapy once a woman was perimenopausal. And that is no solution, because it addresses symptoms. It does not address the root cause.
That's right. And functional medicine and the perspective around functional medicine and hormones is so rich and developed and allows us to understand, one, root causes, but also all the variables in our life that impact our hormones and how to regulate and change those to create balance, whether it's adrenal and stress hormones, thyroid hormones, sex hormones, or insulin. And your book, Women, Food, and Hormones, really helps us to map all that out in a way that gives women a toolkit for how to fix all these problems.
That's right. I mean, this was born of me struggling myself with almost every hormone imbalance that you can imagine, and also struggling with my weight. So unlike you, Mark, when I was sitting down and writing that first book, I gained about 25 pounds. I've never seen your weight fluctuate very much. I don't know. Is that true?
I go up and down. If I go off the reservation, like I was in Italy this summer and I was just eating like bread and pasta and drinking lots of wine, and I gained about 5 pounds in a week. So I can put it on if I go off the tracks. And I actually lost weight from being sick, but my weight couldn't go up and down. But mostly it's pretty stable.
Well, it sure seems stable. And, we know that women have this asymmetric response to stressors, to food. So many of us will gain weight. And there's an evolutionary bias for women to gain weight rather than to lose weight because it helps us with fertility. It helps us with during a pregnancy.
Yes.
So, for those of us who are trying to fit into the clothes in our closet, that can present some problems. So my own struggle with weight, my own struggle with hormones became really the basis of the books that I've written. So I'm a case study as well as someone who's really curious about how do we get these hormones into balance, especially with targeted lifestyle changes, starting first with food. And then how do we get out of that place of misery around hormone balance? Because the truth is, it's so much easier to get your hormones back into balance than to live with the discomfort, the misery of them being out of whack.
Yeah, it's true. And I think the beautiful thing about it is that the solutions are relatively straightforward, and yet you're not hearing about them. And I think that the suffering around hormones is quite extreme. I mean, it's irregular periods, it's heavy periods, it's PMS, which is a whole range of symptoms from breast tenderness and fluid retention to diarrhea, migraines, fatigue, mood changes, sleep issues that can be quite debilitating. And they treat it now, they call it PMDD, which is premenstrual dysphoric disorder. They treat it with like a version of Prozac. Essentially, they change the name of Prozac to some other name, and then they use it for PMS. That's not the solution. And even with postmenopausal symptoms and perimenopausal symptoms, those are often exacerbated by the things that are driving hormonal imbalance. So I'd love for you to talk about what are the things we know that drive hormonal imbalance. And then we'll get to what we do to fix those hormone imbalances. Because I think we know a lot about whether it's food or lifestyle or environmental toxins. Talk about the things that really drive women's hormones out of whack.
Well, you got it. I mean, I would say food is one of the primary drivers. And that includes not just getting sufficient fat, which is the backbone of the sex hormones that you make. It's also getting the right dose of carbohydrates for you, which is so important when it comes to insulin and leptin and some of these other hormones that are involved in fat storage as well as satiety. So getting the carb dose right, also getting the protein dose right. So dialing in these macronutrients becomes incredibly important. And a big part of what was behind this book was that I was struggling not just with weight gain, but with a loss of metabolic health. And that's something that we know affects about 88% of Americans right now. So 88% of us are metabolically unhealthy. Many of us don't know it. So it's not just about the bathroom scale. It's not about diet culture. It's about becoming metabolically healthy. And the hormones are such an essential part of that. So as you described, food, stressors, especially toxic stress, I think a lot of us going through the pandemic had an experience of toxic stress. Some people had weight gain associated with that. There's the changes, there's environmental toxins that we get exposed to that are endocrine disruptors.
Yeah.
So there's, the root causes are something that many of us encounter.
Yeah.
The solutions are not what mainstream medicine is really taught to manage. You talk about how we don't want to normalize this. And, what it reminds me of is that analogy of the frogs in the pot on the stove, where you very slowly turn up the heat and the frog doesn't jump out because it's so slow and imperceptible. And so I don't want women to just sit back and say, oh, my doctor checked my labs and said I'm just getting older. Like, don't settle for that. Don't be dismissed. There's so much misunderstanding about this. And so it takes us taking our health in our own hands and saying, okay, this is not how I want to live my life after 40. I want to change things. Definitely
not. And the things that we also talk about in terms of how to change things in terms of diet. So there's questions that people have about soy foods, and I think about flaxseed. And a lot of people say, oh, soy is bad for you. It's going to cause hormonal dysfunction, and it's an estrogen. What's your take on that? Because I think there's a lot of controversy about that.
There is a lot of controversy. I think the problem is with GMO soy. So I think that, you can go overboard with even whole foods. My general feeling is that some of the benefits associated with soy, with phytoestrogens like flax, outweigh the potential risks of them. I mean, you have to be cautious about getting the dose right. But for the most part, I think having whole soy in your diet once or twice a week, having whole flax in your diet a couple times a week is very healthy for you. It's not really the whole foods that we're having a problem with in the US. It's those processed foods, the ultra processed foods, the foods that are genetically modified. Those are the ones that are causing problems with hormones, not really the whole foods. Same thing with goitrogens. You know, I always get asked about, well, what about the brassica family? Is that going to slow down my thyroid? So you lightly cook them. That reduces the goitrogenic effect. I've looked at the data. I've been underwhelmed by the data really showing a significant impact on thyroid function. You get so many benefits from eating these foods that I think, once again, the benefits outweigh the risks.
시리는 증상, 매드는 솔루션. 시리니엔 시린매드. 부광약품.
It's so true. I think people like, and what cracks me up is a lot of doctors who treat cancer patients, breast cancer patients, will say essentially that they shouldn't eat soy food because they're worried about cancer, and yet they say that it's okay to drink alcohol and to eat sugar and
and to have Ensure. If you're losing weight, have Ensure.
Oh my God. Yeah. It's crazy. It's really crazy. So I think what you're saying is important. I want to come back to the glucose thing because you mentioned the changes in blood sugar and glucose that also affect hormones. And we know, for example, in men who eat a lot of sugar and starch, they tend to get more estrogens. They tend to get breast enlargement or, man boobs. They lose the hair on their body. They get big bellies. They get soft skin. And it's because the fat produces estrogen. And the fat is laid down because of high insulin. And so you discovered a lot by using the continuous glucose monitor, which is really a kind of a new advance in actually personalizing medicine, what you call precision medicine. And you are an advisor to Level, so am I, in terms of this company that is really driving the space around looking at our own blood sugars in real time and how different foods affect it and how we can modify our diet to actually keep our sugars in balance. So what did you learn from doing it yourself, and why is it so important for estrogen and hormone balance in general?
I'm a huge fan of continuous glucose monitoring. The great thing is that you don't have to have a continuous glucose monitor to benefit from monitoring your glucose. You could also use just a $25 glucose meter to get some of the same data. It's not quite as dense or comprehensive. Mm-hmm. But I had a lot of surprises. I started wearing a continuous glucose monitor about 4 years ago. Mm. And at the time I had prediabetes. My fasting glucose was about 105 to 110. Wow. And what I discovered was that many of the foods that I thought were healthy were giving me these massive excursions with glucose. Things like beans, chickpeas, legumes, sweet potatoes, apples, a lot of fruits were just making me spike so high. Grapes, peaches. So what I had to do to reclaim metabolic health was to really dial in my food plan and to avoid some of those foods that were spiking me to the diabetic range. And I found that really helped. So a big part of what I learned as I dove into the literature for this book was that you've got a few choices for metabolic health. One is to go 100% plant-based, and there's a lot of evidence behind that. And what I discovered myself was that being 100% plant-based was not the best fit for me. I started to lose muscle mass. I'm Jewish, I'm hungry all the time, and so 100% plant-based just didn't work very well for me. What can I say?
Wait a minute. When you're eating the way you're now, you're still Jewish and you're not hungry all the time. So I'm not sure that logic flows, Dr. Gottfried.
Well, I have to say keto saved me. So going on a ketogenic diet made my blood sugar go from severely spiky, which you don't want, to a lovely flat line where my mood is more stable. I don't have anxiety anymore. I've got this feeling of like the angels are singing because I can focus. I don't have this jacked up glucose every day. So, 100% plant-based or a ketogenic diet, that's what I found in the literature to be the most evidence-based way to reclaim metabolic health.
Do you want to know my secrets for living a long and happy and healthy life? Well, all I have to do is check out my weekly newsletter, Mark's Picks, where I share my favorite tips for health, longevity, well-being, and lots more. Check it out, and the link below. But often vegan patients start to change their hormonal patterns. They stop menstruating. They have all sorts of issues. So how do you sort of explain that?
Well, what I see with a lot of folks who are vegan or 100% plant-based is that they don't often get sufficient fat. So fat is so important. We talked about how it's making the backbone of your sex hormones. Your body goes from pregnenolone, cholesterol to pregnenolone, the mother hormone of all your sex hormones. That then goes on to make a few other hormones that are so important for your health. And so what I see with a lot of vegans is that they're not getting sufficient fat. They're not getting the extra virgin olive oil, the avocado oil, the nuts, the seeds that they really need. Sometimes they're eating too much processed food because we know there's a lot of vegan processed food that you think might be healthy, but it's not necessarily.
Oh boy. Yeah.
So I think that's a really important piece to understand. And the great thing here is that you can personalize. You can use devices, wearables like continuous glucose monitoring or using a glucose meter to see what sort of food is the best fit for you. What I discovered was that nutritional ketosis or ketogenic diet adapted for women. So with sufficient carbohydrates to keep my thyroid working, to make enough serotonin, to avoid raising my reverse T3, to help me with not raising cortisol too excessively. That's what worked really well for me. And for hundreds of patients who followed after my protocol.
Now you mentioned, muscle mass as being key. Can you talk a little bit more about that in relation to hormones, and particularly sex hormones for men and women, and also cortisol and growth hormone, and insulin, which are all affected by your muscle, which people don't think of as important. I mean, people think, I'm going to work, get my heart healthy, my brain healthy, and get my joints healthy, but no one's like, muscle? But muscle is actually the currency of health.
Muscle is the currency of health. I think I was taught a model that was very disease-centered, not health-centered. And, the work that you and I do, I think, is turning the ship so that we can be more health-centered. And a big part of being health-centered is to make sure that you preserve your muscle mass as you get older. So we know that maintaining your muscle mass, maybe even growing it as you get older, is one of the most essential markers of health span, that period of time that you feel fantastic and relatively free of disease. So one of the things that I found when I was on 100% plant-based diet was that I was losing muscle. And, yes, I had a high-stress life. I think cortisol was part of the story. So high cortisol can be associated with breakdown of muscle. But the other thing to think of with insulin and with blood glucose is that the math comes out to what are your inputs? So what are you eating? But also, how are you disposing of that glucose? And that's where the muscles become so important.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's interesting because muscle is really where your metabolism is. It's all your mitochondria. And as muscle goes down, your insulin goes up, your blood sugar goes up, your blood pressure goes up, your cholesterol goes up, your, sex hormones go down in terms of testosterone for men, growth hormone goes down, cortisol goes up. So you get this whole soup of hormonal change that is characteristic of rapid aging.
Yes. Sarcopenia.
Yeah. So I think it's, I've come to really appreciate it more. And I always talked about exercise and strength training, but I was kind of lazy and I never did it. Well, I like being outside. It was hard enough
in school to put in the time, I have to say.
Well, even after, I like yoga, I like tennis, I like biking, I do other stuff. And it was pretty good cardio. I'm like, I'm right. And yoga's good, but it wasn't. And I actually started doing strength training about a year and a bit ago, and my body has completely changed. I'm going to be 62 shortly, and it's amazing to see what happens when you start to actually use your muscles as they were intended to be used. And unfortunately, we have to do strength training now because we're not living lives where we're actually active and carrying shit and moving stuff around and actually using our bodies. So we have to do it, but it's just amazing. It's made me feel better, more energy. It's helped my metabolism. It's helped my whole way of moving through space and life and the ability to do stuff and have fun. So I don't find myself declining at all. I find the opposite is happening. And, I'm planning on going skiing, helicopter skiing, which is obviously a big luxury, but I've been dreaming about it my whole life, and I'm always terrified. Well, can I do it? Am I strong enough? And now I'm like, I can do anything, which is pretty amazing.
Well, that's such an inspiring message because the truth is it's never too late to change the way that you move. And what you've done with strength training, what I imagine is that you probably have increased your muscle mass, your lean body mass, and that's associated with slowing down the biological clock. So it's so good for you. It's, I think of it in the service of, that means you can like dance with your great grandchildren at their wedding. That's one of the things I hope for myself.
There you go.
Yeah. And to do those things that you've always sort of thought about doing, like the helicopter skiing. I mean, how fantastic to live your life in that way, not sort of signing up for this slow decline that we see in so many folks. We know after age 40 that most of us are gaining 5 pounds of fat and losing 5 pounds of muscle, unless you're doing something active like strength training. So what I talk about in the book is to do about 2/3 of strength training, about 1/3 cardio. I think that combination is probably the most proven when it comes to cardiometabolic health.
So true. So Sarah, your book is so important in this time because, I think more than ever, we're seeing this epidemic of hormonal dysfunction, including insulin, blood sugar, as well as the sex hormones, cortisol, thyroid hormones. And you talk about it so well in your book. Hey, YouTube, if you like this video, you're going to love the next one.
5 to 10% of women are impacted by PCOS. 5 to 10% of women. That's a lot of women.
I mean, listen, if half the population of America is 330 million, if that's the population, half of that's like 65 million.
Yep.
And 10% of that's like 16 million people. That's a lot of people.
Yeah. And, it is PCOS, or polycystic ovarian syndrome, is a syndrome that involves irregular periods or not having any periods and androgen excess or changes in your hormone balance. But it is a syndrome. So that means that there's a continuum where some people have all aspects of PCOS and some people just have some aspects of PCOS. And we can talk more about that. But so there may even be more than this, that we're not even picking up. It's quite common. And it's definitely something we're thinking about all the time when somebody's coming in and complaining about irregular periods or not having had their period for a bunch of months, a young woman that should be having regular, periods.
I think you're really heavy periods. They can miss periods. They can light periods. What are the other symptoms that are pretty common?
Yeah. So we see hirsutism, which is the growth of hair.
That sounds terrible.
Yeah. The growth of hair where women don't want to have it. So on their lip, on their chin, on their abdomen, like in their belly area. So the hair is growing where they don't want to have it. And then they may have hair loss where they want to have hair. So they may have some male pattern hair loss. They get acne. And typically,
wait. So basically, they're losing hair where they don't want to lose it, and they're getting hair where they don't want it, and it's because of these high levels of male hormones, like DHEA and testosterone, that end up causing basically this male appearance almost.
Yeah, their hair growth shifts because their hormones shift, and
so you see the bearded women in the circus. That's what this is, right?
Yes. Well, some of them may have had some other things going on too, to an extreme, right? But yes, in general, this is, you're starting to grow hair where you don't want it, and not having good hair where on the top of your head where you want it, and all because there's been a real shift in your hormone balance in your body. And so when we actually check, we see high levels, like you mentioned, of that DHEA in the blood. We may see high testosterone levels or high free testosterone levels. And so those are some of the biomarkers that will show up when you look.
Yeah, and you also get acne, bad acne.
Bad acne, yeah. And a lot of times, like in the lower jaw area, acne, and sometimes cystic acne. And then they'll often gain weight. Now, not everybody with PCOS is overweight. There's a lot of women, and we can even talk more about that today. There's a lot of women who don't have the obesity part of it, and they're just dealing with irregular periods. But for a good portion of women with PCOS, they gain weight because of the high levels of insulin that are going on. So, if they have high levels of insulin floating around, so with PCOS, typically there is high levels of insulin. And we've talked about insulin so many times on this podcast, and you've talked about it many times, but that insulin is that hormone that helps us balance our blood sugar. So you eat a meal, the body makes insulin. That insulin tells your body to take your food and get it into your muscles so it can be used for energy. And what happens when somebody has insulin resistance is their body's not listening to that insulin as well. And they've got high levels of insulin. And that high level of insulin will cause people to gain weight around the belly. And so we often see with PCOS that weight gain around the belly, that belly weight.
Yeah, so this sounds like a miserable condition. You get pimples, you lose hair on your head, you grow a beard, you are infertile, your periods are all over the place. This just sounds terrible. And traditional medicine has very kind of weird approach to it, because the way I think about it is that it's called polycystic ovarian syndrome, which makes people think it's a gynecological problem, but it's actually a dietary problem.
Right. It's often a dietary problem. And, it's not always dietary, which is so interesting, right? Because we're learning about how toxins from the environment, like BPA and plastics, and we're learning about the microbiome and how that can be a trigger. So there's toxins and dysbiosis or imbalance in the microbiome are common things that we see.
Toxins can cause insulin resistance.
Absolutely.
And the microbiome imbalances can cause insulin resistance and prediabetes. So it's all connected.
It's all connected. And you're right. And a huge portion of people, it's dietary as well, where they're but I think it's important to remember it's not always that, right? Yeah. But there's a huge portion of people where they're just eating too many carbohydrates, too many refined and processed carbohydrates for their body. So, or for anybody's body. But those high levels of refined and processed carbohydrates really can be a trigger for this insulin resistance and weight gain. And then that insulin resistance shifts the hormone balance, and then you get this imbalance in hormones, and you get the high androgens or testosterone and DHEA, and then the periods get irregular. So, but interestingly, as a syndrome, it's important that we pay attention to that individual person, because it's very different. You may have 10 women in a room with PCOS, and you may have 10 really different reasons for why they have PCOS.
No, that goes to
They're really not all the same. Yeah, it's really an interesting aspect for functional medicine doctors to work on.
That just speaks to the whole approach of functional medicine, which is because you know the name of your disease, it doesn't mean you know what's wrong with you. Right.
Absolutely.
It's just this description of the symptoms, but not the cause. And so functional medicine is about the cause. It's about why, not what. Not what disease you have, PCOS, but why do you have that? Right. And traditional medicine, the symptoms are treated symptomatically. So what are the traditional treatments that you see regular doctors giving for PCOS?
Yeah. So often women will be placed on birth control pills, because if they're having irregular periods or they're skipping their period, many times the physician will put them on birth control pills because it will regulate their cycle. They'll put them maybe on metformin, because metformin improves insulin sensitivity.
It's a diabetes drug.
Yeah. So, and then that can many times help with the weight gain. It sometimes helps with the acne and the hair growth or hair loss. And they'll often put them on spironolactone, which is another medication that helps with balancing the hormones and can help with some of the symptoms.
Yeah, it's a diuretic, and it just blocks the conversion of testosterone to the kind that really causes the hair loss.
Yep.
Called DHT, but it's really fascinating. But it really doesn't speak to addressing the root causes. So, from a functional medicine perspective, what are the root causes for PCOS, and how do we start to deal with these?
Yeah, so as you mentioned already, diet is huge. Diet has a huge impact. When somebody's eating too many of the refined and processed carbs, too much sugar, too many of those coffee drinks with sugar in it, juices, sodas, refined and processed oatmeals, cereals, and pastas and breads and muffins, and those foods that we've been grabbing too much of. For some people with some genetics, that can really throw off this whole system in their body. Another big common area are toxins. I see this a lot.
Yeah.
I see a lot of, I think is toxin related. We know genetics plays a huge role here. We also know that what women are exposed to as a fetus, when what has happening to their mom is really when their mom's pregnant with them, that really impacts their hormone balance and their metabolism later in life.
So what the mom's eating,
yes,
she's at Dunkin' Donuts all day and
what's fascinating with
eating the frappa mocha latte wattes, all day long with more sugar than 3 cans of Coke. I mean, yeah, people don't realize that.
Yeah, so when they're pregnant with their baby, it's really important that they're paying attention to what they're eating, because if they're gaining too much weight or eating too many refined carbs or not gaining enough weight, it's kind of interesting. So if they're not gaining enough weight, or they're gaining way too much weight, or they're eating too many refined and processed carbs and sugars, that really throws off the fetus, that baby's metabolism. And so, sometimes, we tell our patients, you can just blame it on your mom.
We call it epigenetics, which in the genes get tagged, and messages of, Jeff Bland's called the Book of Life, and where the bookmarks are in the Book of Life, you've got this whole genetic code, but not all of it gets read, but you can bookmark different aspects of it depending on what exposures you've had. And we know this from lots of research on epigenetics, that what the mother does, what she eats, what she's exposed to, her thoughts, feelings, all those tag the baby's genes for what happens to them in the future, and whether they get diabetes or heart disease or cancer or obesity. Yep. I mean, it's all programmed, but that doesn't mean it's not fixable.
Absolutely.
You can
Great point.
actually modify your gene expression. And that's what functional medicine is all about, is changing the environment. Then the big picture of the environment, meaning your diet, lifestyle, toxins, et cetera,
Yep.
how all of those inputs affect your gene expression is what functional medicine is about. It's about modifying your lifestyle and your environment to influence your genes, to change your health in every aspect.
Yeah, so for some people, it's harder for them than others. Like, some people come in and they're like, it's just not fair. I have to be so much more careful than my friend Susie, right? And it's true, because there are some people, yes, there are some people that have to be so much more careful with their diet. I mean, we all should be eating a healthy diet, but some people have to be more careful with the carbohydrates than others.
Yeah, I would say, there are a few people who are better adapted to higher carbohydrate diets, and there are very few.
Yeah.
I know a few of them, and those are the ones who stay skinny eating anything. But when you look at the fact that 88% of Americans are metabolic unhealthy, almost 9 out of 10 of us have some degree of insulin resistance.
Yep.
That should get our attention. It's probably the majority of us who don't do well with a lot of starch and sugar.
Yep.
And there's a continuum, right? Some can do more, some can do less. Some look at a bagel and they gain weight, literally, because they think about it and their insulin goes up and they put all the fat on their bodies. I want to jump back to something you quickly talked about, which is toxins. And I want you to explain how environmental toxins and what toxins influence hormones and influence insulin resistance. Because both of those things are going on with PCOS. And I think it's something people don't understand.
Yeah. This was impacting men more than women, but we realized Agent Orange, right? So when men were exposed, there may have been a few women. I don't really know how many women went to Vietnam. Probably not very many, right?
Not too many.
Not too many. So when they were exposed to Agent Orange in Vietnam, they had a much higher rate. They have a much higher rate of getting diabetes with less weight gain, right? So that's when we started to say, oh, this is interesting. There's a real interesting connection between toxins in the environment and our metabolism and our weight.
And then we get diabetes.
And they get
Those
diabetes.
Who got Agent Orange exposure had lots more diabetes.
Lots more diabetes at less weight gain. So, I'm just going to make this up here, make up some numbers, but just so people understand, they may have only had to gain 10 pounds or 20 pounds to get type 2 diabetes, where a typical American maybe was gaining 50 pounds before they got type 2 diabetes.
Right.
Just for an example. So they were getting type 2 diabetes with less weight gain, meaning that there was more to it than just the weight gain, right? And that's when we realized that these toxins were damaging probably the mitochondria, right? So that powerhouse of your cells. We also know BPA, that plastic, that's been really really well studied to show there's a connection with insulin resistance.
Yes.
We've known for a long time about the connection with breast cancer and BPA, but there's also this connection with insulin resistance and weight gain. So that hard plastic, they use BPA in the lining of cans or on receipts.
Baby bottles.
I know, right?
Yeah, when you get your credit card receipt, your gas station receipt, the people say, "Do you want your receipt?" I'm like, "No, thanks."
Right.
I'm like, "You take it," because I don't want to constantly expose myself. It gets absorbed through the skin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, we realized that this toxin caused weight gain, insulin resistance, and I'm sure there's a lot of other toxins that we haven't even, figured out yet that are really influencing.
Well, pretty much all the petrochemical toxins, all the plastics and all the fossil fuel derived toxins are endocrine disruptors. And I read way back when we were at Canyon Ranch, I read a book called Our Stolen Future by Theo Colburn, which was about the ways in which these environmental toxins were disrupting reproductive health of animals and humans. And I was like, oh my God. And so what's going on is that these are not just one exposure. So you're not just exposed to BPA. You're exposed to literally hundreds of these in our daily life through our modern living. And there are ways to reduce it. And I think the Environmental Working Group is a great resource for finding out what household products, skincare products, cleaning products, are food products that you can eat that are not going to be full of these chemicals. And you just go to ewg.org. So that's important. Hey, everybody, it's Dr. Hyman. Thanks for tuning into the Doctor's Pharmacy. I hope you're loving this podcast. It's one of my favorite things to do, and introducing you to all the experts that I know and I love and that I've learned so much from. And I want to tell you about something else I'm doing, which is called Mark's Picks. It's my weekly newsletter. And in it, I share my favorite stuff, from foods to supplements to gadgets to tools to enhance your health. It's all the cool stuff that I use and that my team uses to optimize and enhance our health. And I'd love you to sign up for the weekly newsletter. I'll only send it to you once a week on Fridays. Nothing else, I promise. And all you have to do is go to drhyman.com/picks to sign up. That's drhyman.com/picks, P-I-C-K-S, and sign up for the newsletter. And I'll share with you my favorite stuff that I use to enhance my health and get healthier and better and live younger, longer. Now back to this week's episode. So let's talk now about the gut, because most people don't really think that your hormones are connected to your gut microbiome, but it's incredibly connected.
Fascinating. It's so fascinating, but they've shown that there's certain types of molecules from the gram-negative bacteria in our gut. So if the microbiome, if all of those trillions of bacteria are out of balance and there's an overgrowth of some unhealthy bacteria in our gut, that these gram-negative bacteria have something on them called LPS, or lipopolysaccharides, that these things can then, these components can get into the body. And they've shown that this can trigger this insulin resistance in our body, so that people, when they have higher levels of these abnormal bacteria, will have more insulin resistance.
That's absolutely right. So, we there's a name for this. We call it metabolic endotoxemia, which is a fancy way of saying that the poison crap in your gut leaks into your bloodstream and your immune system goes, and starts creating an inflammatory response, which then affects your insulin sensitivity. So anything that causes inflammation, right? Anything, stress, bad food, toxins, infections, microbiome nastiness, all that can drive inflammation that can cause insulin resistance.
Yes.
So you don't have to even be eating sugar, right? But if your gut's a mess for various reasons, then you have to fix the gut. And also, there's a lot of effect on insulin resistance, but there's also other effects in the gut around the kind of bacteria that are there and how they affect your metabolic processing of estrogens and other hormones. So it's really important to eat the right kinds of fiber and the right kinds of foods and to feed your microbiome and your inner garden. So we've talked about a lot of things. We've talked about diet. We've talked about stress. We've talked about environmental toxins. We've talked about the gut microbiome. All these things play a role. And so the job of a functional medicine doctor is to dig down and figure these things out. So how do we begin to assess these? and I want you to share a little bit about some cases, but how do we assess? Because it seems like a lot of stuff that you go to the endocrinologist or the gynecologist, they're not like looking at your poop. They're not measuring your toxin levels. They're not looking necessarily at insulin resistance very well. What do we look at that's so different here at the Ultra Wellness Center and through the lens of functional medicine?
I mean, I think that's what's critical about functional medicine and what we do is we get a really good detailed history. And that gives us a lot of information. So when we take the time to get to know our patient and get all of the history of their life, their timeline of their life, what things have happened to them, what illnesses they've had, what disruptions they've had, what exposures they've had, what other things are going on in their body, that really impacts where we go and what we choose to look for. So you get a really good history first and foremost, and then that informs you what you want to test. You could test everything, but this ends up being a lot of tests. So what's important is to get a really good history so you know where to really focus. So for one person, it may be, I really got to look at their gut microbiome. I've got to figure they've got this sort of history. I think that might be an area that we really have to focus on. I want to look at what the balance of the good and bad bacteria are. I want to see if they have maybe some of these lipopolysaccharide components that may be triggering inflammation and insulin resistance. Or maybe somebody else, you've got a sense based on their history and some of their other symptoms that it's more toxin related. Or somebody else, it may be, it's more lifestyle related. And you've got to just really focus more on breaking that cycle of craving those carbohydrates. Because what happens for a lot of people is it becomes a vicious cycle. Right? They eat the carbohydrates, the real refined processed carbohydrates, their insulin goes up. But then they end up, they gain some weight, then they crave more and more of them, and it becomes this vicious cycle that gets out of hand. And I think that's important to pay attention
it's so important.
to.
And we really, don't just look at the hormone levels, which typical endocrinologists or GYN, we look at those too, but because they're very helpful and informative to look at the testosterone levels, DHT, and look at DHEAS and all kinds of things that we look at. But we also looking at toxin load. We're looking at the microbiome.